I remember the night it all started to unravel. Jessica had told me she wouldn't be working late and was planning a sleepover at her friend Ashley's place. A girls' night, she said. At the time, I didn't question it. We'd been married for 7 years, and although things had been off lately, I figured it was just the usual ups and downs that come with time. I told her to have fun and thought nothing of it. That night, I stayed home. She didn't come back the next morning, just like she said, and when she got home the following afternoon, she acted like everything was normal. I didn't push her on it, but something gnawed at me. She was distant. When I asked how her night went, she just shrugged and said, "Good. You know, the usual girl stuff." But her tone felt off, like she wasn't telling me the whole story. The next night, Mike, my best friend, asked if I wanted to grab a drink. We hadn't gone out in a while, so I figured why not? Anything to take my mind off the weird feeling I had about Jessica. So, we hit a bar we used to go to back in the day. Nothing fancy, just a place to unwind. Mike was talking about his job, but honestly, I wasn't really tuned in. My thoughts kept drifting to Jessica. Then, out of nowhere, I saw her. Jessica. But she wasn't at Ashley's, and she definitely wasn't acting like a woman who was just out on another girls' night. She was with a guy I'd never seen before, laughing and touching him like they were more than friends. The way they leaned into each other, the way she smiled at him, it was all too familiar. My heart dropped. Mike must have noticed my face change because he asked, "You good, man?" I didn't answer. I couldn't take my eyes off of them. They were so wrapped up in each other. They didn't even notice me sitting there, just a few tables away. She had her hand on his arm, and they were whispering like it was some kind of secret. It felt like a punch to the gut, but I didn't make a scene. Instead, I calmly pulled out my phone and snapped a picture of them together. I wasn't sure what I'd do with it yet, but I knew I needed evidence. Then I stood up, told Mike I had to go, and walked out of that bar without a word to either of them. When I got home that night, Jessica hadn't returned yet. I didn't text her, didn't call. I just waited. By the time she walked through the door a few hours later, I had already decided I wasn't going to confront her. Not yet. She acted like nothing had happened, like she wasn't sneaking around behind my back. I played along, pretending everything was fine, even though the truth was burning a hole in my chest. That's when I decided I needed more than just one picture. I needed proof, real proof, and I had a plan in mind. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured Jessica with that guy, laughing, touching, being with him like I didn't even exist. I knew I couldn't just let it slide. Confronting her right away would only lead to excuses, maybe even tears, and I wasn't interested in hearing whatever lies she was ready to spin. No, I needed to be smarter than that. I needed to know exactly who this guy was and how long it had been going on. So, I hired a private investigator. I didn't tell anyone, not even Mike. This was something I had to handle on my own. I found a reputable detective firm online, someone discreet who could dig up the dirt I needed without Jessica catching wind of it. When I met with the investigator, a no-nonsense guy named Greg, I showed him the picture I'd taken at the bar. "This is the guy," I told him. "I need to know who he is, how long this has been going on, and anything else you can find." Greg didn't ask many questions, just nodded and said he'd get started. He told me it might take a few weeks to gather everything, but I didn't care how long it took. I wasn't rushing this. I wanted to be prepared when the time came to confront her, and more importantly, I wanted to make sure this guy got what was coming to him. In the meantime, I acted normal around Jessica. I smiled when she smiled, nodded when she told me about her day, and pretended like I hadn't seen her with another man. She didn't suspect a thing, which only made me angrier. The way she went about her daily routine like everything was fine, like she wasn't betraying me, it fueled the fire that was building inside. About 2 weeks later, Greg called. He had the information I needed. I met him at a diner on the outskirts of town, far enough from where Jessica or anyone else might see us. He handed me a folder and said, "Your wife's been seeing this guy for about 6 months. His name's Andrew Sullivan, a big-shot client from her job." I stared at the photo of them together. Andrew was older, polished, the kind of guy who looked like he had more money than he knew what to do with. Greg continued, "He's a businessman, runs a chain of high-end car dealerships. Married, with a family. Your wife is just his latest distraction." The rage I felt wasn't just about Jessica anymore. It was about this smug, Rich guy who thought he could take whatever he wanted without consequence. I knew the type. Guys like him never faced the fallout of their actions. They could ruin marriages and lives and walk away without a scratch. Not this time. That's when my plan for revenge started to take shape. I wasn't just going to expose Jessica's affair. No, that would be too easy. I wanted to make sure Andrew paid for what he had done. I didn't care if he was rich or powerful. I was going to ruin him, and I knew exactly how to do it. First, I needed to dig deeper into Andrew's business dealings. If I could find something shady, something illegal, I could hit him where it hurt the most: his career and reputation. I had no doubt that a guy like him had skeletons in his closet, and I was determined to bring them out. When I got home that night, Jessica was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. She looked up and smiled at me, completely unaware of the storm that was coming. I smiled back, playing the role of the oblivious husband, but inside, I was already putting the pieces in place to destroy everything she had with him. Once I knew who Andrew Sullivan was, the pieces of my revenge plan started falling into place. He was a wealthy businessman, but like a lot of these types, his success came with a trail of questionable decisions. I had Greg dig deeper, and sure enough, we found it: fraudulent deals, tax evasion, and a few under-the-table transactions that could destroy his empire if they ever saw the light of day. But I wasn't going to expose him outright. That would be too simple, and he might be able to cover it up with his money and lawyers. No, I needed to ruin him from the inside, make it so there was no way he could escape the fallout. The first step was getting close to some of his business partners. I'd learned enough about his operations to know that he was in bed with people just as dirty as he was. Partners who wouldn't hesitate to throw him under the bus if it meant saving themselves. I started making some anonymous calls, dropping hints about shady deals, raising suspicion. Greg helped me set up fake emails posing as an insider. Soon, there were rumors flying around Andrew's business circles, whispers about fraud and bad deals. It was only a matter of time before someone bit. Meanwhile, Jessica had no idea what was happening. She continued to see Andrew, thinking she was getting away with it. At home, she played the role of a loving wife, but I could see through her now. Every time she touched her phone, smiled at a message, or told me she was going out with the girls, I knew exactly what she was doing. I let her dig her own grave, all the while pretending I was none the wiser. About a month later, the trap started closing in on Andrew. His business partners began pulling away, nervous about the rumors that were swirling. I found out through Greg that the tax authorities were beginning to take a closer look at his books, and his biggest investors were growing uneasy. He was starting to sweat, but he didn't know who was behind it. Then, one evening, I decided it was time to confront Jessica. Not with a confrontation, not with yelling or accusations. I wanted her to confess, to squirm under the weight of her own lies. She had told me she was going to Ashley's again. Another lie, of course. I pretended to believe her and let her leave. About 2 hours later, I sent her a text. "I know what you've been doing, Jessica. It's over. Come home, and we'll talk." Simple but effective. She must have panicked because she didn't respond right away. When she finally did, the message was short. "What are you talking about?" That's when I sent her the photo. The one I had taken of her and Andrew at the bar, wrapped up in each other like teenagers. The silence that followed was all the confirmation I needed. When she came home later that night, her face was pale, eyes wide with fear. She didn't even bother pretending. She knew I had her. I can explain," she stammered, but I just shook my head. "There's nothing to explain, Jessica. I know everything. How long has this been going on? 6 months? A year?" Her mouth opened, but no words came out. I didn't need her to say anything. I already knew. "You thought I wouldn't find out?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. "You thought you could just sneak around behind my back and I wouldn't notice?" She tried to cry, tried to play the victim, but I wasn't having it. "Not this time. I'm not going to scream at you, Jessica. I'm not going to make a scene. We're done. And as for Andrew, his life is about to come crashing down. You might want to distance yourself from him before it's too late." She looked confused, like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had no idea about the damage I'd been doing behind the scenes, no clue that I had set up Andrew to lose everything. I could see the realization sinking in as she began to panic. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice shaky. You'll find out soon enough, I said, turning to leave the room. But I'm not sticking around to watch it. I walked out of the house that night and never looked back. Jessica had destroyed our marriage, but I wasn't going to let her destroy me. I knew the storm I'd set in motion was about to rip her lover's life apart, and when it did, she'd have nowhere to run. It didn't take long for the cracks in Andrew Sullivan's perfect little world to start showing. I'd set everything in motion, and now all I had to do was watch it unravel. I wasn't in a hurry. The beauty of revenge is in the patience it requires. I wanted him to suffer the way I had, slowly and painfully. The first signs of trouble hit when one of his biggest clients pulled out of a major deal. Greg had kept tabs on Andrew's business, and it turned out that whispers of fraud had reached all the wrong people. The client wasn't taking chances and bailed, leaving Andrew scrambling. His investors began to pull back too, suddenly cautious about being tied to a man with so much smoke swirling around him. Jessica, meanwhile, didn't seem to have a clue. She hadn't mentioned Andrew once since our confrontation. She kept her distance, probably trying to figure out how much I knew and whether or not I was serious about ending things. But I was done playing games. The moment I sent her that photo, I knew there was no going back. Our marriage was already over. She just hadn't accepted it yet. Then, I got the call I'd been waiting for. Greg had uncovered some damning evidence, documents that proved Andrew had been cooking the books for years. Tax evasion, fraudulent contracts, and payments hidden in offshore accounts. It was more than enough to bury him. I didn't even have to get my hands dirty with this part. Once Greg sent the information to the right authorities, it was only a matter of time before the investigation began. It wasn't long after that when Andrew's world truly collapsed. The IRS got involved, and when the news broke, his reputation was shattered. All the people who had been close to him, his business partners, clients, even some of his so-called friends, turned their backs on him. Investors bailed, and his businesses began to crumble one by one. As Andrew's career disintegrated, Jessica tried to keep her distance from him, but it was too late. Word got around about their affair, and she became known as the woman who had wrecked his life. Her colleagues whispered behind her back, and her friends stopped returning her calls. It was almost funny to watch her try to salvage her reputation, but there was nothing she could do. She had tied herself to a sinking ship, and now she was going down with it. The fallout hit hard, and it didn't stop there. I made sure the information I'd gathered about Andrew reached his wife. When she found out about the affair, she filed for divorce, taking the kids and half of everything he had left. In the end, he was left with nothing. No career, no family, and no future. As for Jessica, she broke things off with Andrew when it became clear that he couldn't save her either. But by that point, I had already decided I was done. One evening, she sat me down and tried to apologize, saying she made a mistake and wanted to work things out. I looked her straight in the eye and said, "I know about everything, Jessica, and I'm done." She started to cry, but it didn't move me. All I could think about was how she had lied, how she had betrayed me, and how I'd waited patiently for the moment when I could finally break free. "I've already spoken to a lawyer," I said, standing up from the table. "The divorce papers are on their way. We're done." Her face went pale as it hit her that this was real, that she couldn't talk her way out of it. "Where will I go?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't care," I said coldly. "That's your problem now." I left her sitting there in the house we had shared for years, a shell of the woman she used to be. I knew she'd have to move away, start over in some new city where no one knew her name or what she had done. But I didn't care. I had my closure, and I wasn't looking back. After I ended things with Jessica, the house felt emptier than I ever thought possible. Even though I was the one who decided to end it, there's something about a marriage breaking down that leaves a hollow feeling inside. It wasn't sadness exactly, more like the death of something I thought would last forever. The divorce papers were sent, and just like that, 7 years of marriage dissolved into legal documents and signatures. Jessica moved out shortly after. She didn't argue. What could she say? We both knew there was no saving what we had. She didn't try to beg or fight me on it, probably realizing she had nothing left to bargain with. Her affair with Andrew had tainted everything. I heard she packed up and moved to another city to start over. Maybe she thought she could outrun her reputation, but it didn't matter to me anymore. Her life was no longer my concern. Once she was gone, I had the house to myself. You'd think there would be a sense of freedom that comes with that. And in some ways, there was no more pretending, no more lies, no more feeling like a fool every time she walked through the door. But it wasn't exactly a clean break. There were memories in every corner of that place, good and bad. Every time I passed the living room, I thought about the nights we spent there together, watching TV like we were any other happy couple. When I walked into the kitchen, I could still see her sitting at the table, smiling over her morning coffee, back when things were good. But the truth is, you don't really heal by staying in the same place where everything fell apart. So, after a few months, I decided to sell the house. There was no point holding on to a place that no longer felt like home. I needed a fresh start, somewhere without all the baggage. Mike helped me find a new place, a small apartment on the other side of town. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was mine, just mine. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into work. It wasn't the most exciting way to move on, but it kept me focused on something other than the wreckage of my marriage. I started going to the gym again, reconnecting with friends I hadn't seen much during the worst of it. Life was starting to feel normal again, slowly but surely. One afternoon, I ran into Greg, the investigator I had hired. We grabbed a coffee, and he filled me in on the latest gossip about Andrew. Apparently, after his business fell apart, he tried to rebuild, but no one would touch him. His name had become toxic in the industry. Every deal he tried to make fell through, and his former associates wanted nothing to do with him. It was a satisfying feeling, knowing I had been the one to set that in motion. Andrew Sullivan, the guy who thought he could take whatever he wanted, was now just another cautionary tale of a man who flew too close to the sun. I won't lie. There were nights when I thought about what might have been if Jessica hadn't done what she did. I wondered how we had drifted so far apart without me seeing the signs. But in the end, none of that mattered anymore. I wasn't the man who ignored the truth any longer. I was someone who had learned from it. I wasn't naive anymore, and if nothing else, the whole mess had taught me to trust my instincts. Months passed, and with each one, I felt lighter. My life was my own again, free from the lies, the deceit, and the constant second-guessing. I didn't jump into another relationship right away, didn't feel the need to. For the first time in a long time, I was content just being on my own. Sometimes, people ask me if I ever regretted the way things ended, if I felt bad about what I did to Andrew, or if I should have tried harder to save my marriage. But the truth is, I don't regret any of it. Jessica made her choices, and so did I. She wanted to play me for a fool, and she got burned. As for Andrew, he deserved everything he got. Some people have to learn the hard way that they can't just ruin lives and walk away unscathed. And as for me, well, I moved on. And that's what matters. Life had started to feel normal again. I was moving on, new apartment, new routines, even thinking about dating again. Everything felt like it was falling into place after the mess with Jessica and Andrew. But as it turns out, I was wrong. I didn't know how wrong until one evening when I came home from work and found an envelope taped to my door. There was no return address, just my name, Daniel, scrawled across the front in a rushed, almost frantic handwriting. My stomach dropped as soon as I saw it. I tore it open, expecting something from Jessica, but inside was a single piece of paper with just a few words typed in the center. You think you've won, but the real game is just beginning. Jessica wasn't the only one playing you. My heart started pounding as I read the message again and again. What the hell was this supposed to mean? Jessica was out of my life. Her affair with Andrew had ended, her reputation was destroyed, and she had moved away. I had taken everything from her, or so I thought. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept replaying the last few months in my head, trying to figure out what I'd missed. I'd been so focused on ruining Andrew's life and exposing Jessica. But now, this letter. What game? Who else could have been involved? Then a week later, I got another letter. This one was worse. Inside was a photo, grainy, like it had been taken from a distance. It was me and Greg, the private investigator I had hired, sitting at that diner months ago when I first told him about Jessica's affair. The message below the photo sent a chill through my spine. You weren't as secretive as you thought. You were being watched the whole time. My hands started shaking. Someone had been watching me, tracking everything I'd done. This was no coincidence. It wasn't a prank or some random person trying to mess with me. Whoever was behind this knew exactly what I had been up to. I needed answers, and fast. I called Greg the next day, told him we had to meet. When we sat down at the same diner, I slid the photo across the table. He stared at it, his face hard to read. "Do you know anything about this?" I asked, my voice steady but my mind racing. Greg didn't answer right away. He picked up the photo, studied it, then finally spoke. "I told you we kept everything discreet. This is unexpected." "Unexpected? Someone has been watching me, Greg, and they knew enough to follow us from the start. What the hell is going on?" Greg hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything. He wasn't telling me the whole story. "Look," he said, lowering his voice. "There's something you need to know. Jessica wasn't as clueless as you thought." "What do you mean?" I demanded. "She knew you were onto her," he said slowly, like he was choosing each word carefully. "I think she had a feeling you were going to find out about Andrew. So she took precautions. She didn't just go to Andrew for help. She reached out to someone else." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "Who? Who the hell else was involved?" Greg sighed, rubbing his temples. "It wasn't just Andrew, man. There was another guy before him. Someone with more power, more money. He's not just some businessman. Jessica, she's been in contact with him the whole time. When she realized you were digging into her affair, she used him to keep tabs on you." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Jessica had known all along? She wasn't just the cheating wife I thought I was outsmarting. She had been 2 steps ahead of me the entire time. "Why the hell didn't you tell me this earlier?" I snapped. "Because I didn't know for sure," Greg replied, his voice steady but firm. "I only put it together recently. This guy? He's dangerous. He's got connections. And now that Jessica's moved on from Andrew, she's back under his protection." My head was spinning. Everything I thought I knew, everything I had done to destroy her world felt like a setup. Jessica had played me, not just with Andrew, but from the beginning. And now, whoever this other guy was, he was watching me, pulling the strings. "What does he want?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know yet," Greg said, leaning back in his chair. "But whatever it is, it's not going to be good." The more I thought about Greg's words, the angrier I got. Jessica hadn't just betrayed me with Andrew. She'd been using me, playing a game I didn't even know I was part of. And now, there was this new guy lurking in the background, pulling strings. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd walked into a trap from the very start. But I wasn't going to just sit back and let them win. Not after everything I'd done to take them down. I needed to know more. I needed to figure out who this guy was and why he was watching me. Over the next few days, I threw myself into digging. Greg was able to track down some vague details about this mystery man, a powerful investor named Victor Rhodes. I didn't know much about him yet, but what I learned was enough to tell me he wasn't someone you crossed easily. He had his hands in all kinds of businesses, from real estate to tech startups, and he didn't get to the top by playing nice. Rumor had it, he'd made people disappear when they became a problem for him. It didn't take long for me to realize that Jessica had been involved with him long before Andrew came into the picture. In fact, it seemed like Andrew was just a distraction, a way for her to cover up the Betrayal affair. Victor had been financing her lifestyle, paying for everything she wanted, and in return, Jessica kept their relationship hidden. Andrew was nothing more than a pawn in their game, just like I had been. I started putting the pieces together. Jessica had been setting me up from the beginning, making sure I was focused on Andrew while Victor stayed in the shadows, untouched. She knew that if I found out about the affair with Andrew, I'd be too distracted to see the bigger picture. And it worked until now. The letters, the photos, the warnings, it was all Victor's doing. He was trying to intimidate me, to keep me from digging any further. But now that I knew the truth, I wasn't going to stop. I couldn't. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about survival. The more I learned about Victor, the more dangerous he seemed. His connections ran deep, and I knew that if I wasn't careful, he could ruin me just as easily as I'd ruined Andrew. But I wasn't going to back down. I had taken down one powerful man already. What was one more? I decided to confront Jessica. I needed to see if she'd crack under the pressure, if there was any part of her that would give me the truth. I arranged to meet her in a public place, a coffee shop where I knew she wouldn't be able to pull any stunts. When she walked in, she looked different, worn out, like she hadn't been sleeping. For a moment, I wondered if Victor had started to turn on her too. I kept my expression neutral as she sat down across from me. "Why are we doing this, Daniel?" she asked, her voice tired. "I think you know why," I said, leaning forward. "I know about Victor." Her eyes flickered with something, fear, guilt. I couldn't tell, but she quickly masked it. "Victor has nothing to do with this," she said too quickly. I shook my head. "Cut the lies, Jessica. You've been working with him the whole time, haven't you? You let me think Andrew was the problem, but all along, you've been with Victor." She glanced around the cafe, her hands trembling slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about," she whispered, but I could see the panic in her eyes. "I have the letters," I continued, keeping my voice steady. "The photos. He's been watching me, and I know you've been helping him." Jessica's facade cracked. "Daniel, you don't understand. You have no idea what you're getting yourself into." "Then explain it to me," I shot back. "Tell me why you've been playing me this whole time. Why you dragged me into whatever mess you and Victor are in." She looked down at the table, her voice barely audible. "It wasn't supposed to go this far." My heart pounded in my chest. "What do you mean?" Jessica swallowed hard. "Victor, he doesn't just control businesses. He controls people. He owns them. When I first got involved with him, I thought it was just an affair, but then things changed. He started expecting things, favors. And once I was in, I couldn't get out. He's been watching you because he thinks you're a threat." "A threat?" I laughed bitterly. "What could I possibly do to him?" "It's not just you, Daniel. He's using you. Your leverage. He knows about everything you did to Andrew, and now he wants to make sure you don't come after him next." I stared at her, disbelief washing over me. I had thought I was the one in control, the one pulling the strings, but now it was clear I had been the puppet all along. Jessica's words hung in the air like a fog I couldn't see through. "Victor's using me?" I repeated, trying to wrap my head around it. "For what?" She looked exhausted, her eyes darting nervously around the cafe. "Victor's not just some rich guy. He's dangerous, Daniel. I didn't know that when I first got involved with him. He's got his hands in everything, businesses, politics, you name it. And when I wanted out, he made it clear that wasn't an option. So, why involve me? Why keep this charade going?" I demanded, my voice rising. She sighed, her hands trembling as she gripped her coffee cup. "You weren't supposed to get involved. He thought you'd stay clueless, focused on Andrew. But when you started digging, when you hired Greg, you became a problem. He didn't want you messing with his plans. Andrew was just a distraction. But now he sees you as a threat." I leaned back in my chair, feeling a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I had thought I was the one orchestrating the fall of Andrew, the one in control. But the entire time, Victor had been playing me, using me to distract attention from his own shadowy operations. "And Greg?" I asked, suddenly suspicious. "Is he involved with Victor too?" Jessica shook her head. "Greg doesn't know. Victor didn't care about him. He only cared about you. You were the one getting too close to something he couldn't afford to lose. He's been watching you because he's afraid you'll expose more than just Andrew." I swallowed hard, a knot forming in my throat. "What does he want?" Jessica hesitated before answering. "He wants you to stop. Stop digging. Stop asking questions. He knows you're smart, Daniel. You've already ruined Andrew. And Victor knows you could do the same to him if you get too close. If you keep pushing, he won't just watch. He'll make a move." I could hear the desperation in her voice, but I wasn't buying it. "So what, Jessica? You came here to warn me, to tell me to back off? Why now? You've been feeding me lies this whole time, and now you expect me to just take your word for it." Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't flinch. "I didn't have a choice," she whispered. "He owns me, Daniel. He threatened me, my family. You don't know what he's capable of." My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of everything. I wanted to believe she was just a pawn in Victor's game, but a part of me still felt like she was manipulating me. I had trusted her once, and she'd burned me. I wasn't about to let that happen again. "I'm not backing down," I said firmly. "Not now. If Victor's worried about me, that means I'm on the right track. I'm going to finish what I started." Jessica's eyes widened in fear. You don't understand. He's watching you. Every move you make, he's a step ahead. If you go after him, he'll destroy you. I leaned in, lowering my voice. Then let him try. I stood up, throwing a few bills on the table and turning to leave. But as I walked away, Jessica grabbed my arm, her voice trembling. Please, Daniel, don't make this worse. You have no idea what he's capable of. I pulled my arm free and walked out, my mind racing. I wasn't sure if I believed everything Jessica had told me, but I knew one thing for certain. Victor Rhodes was my real enemy now. He had been pulling the strings from the start, using Jessica, using Andrew, and now he was trying to use me. But I wasn't going to let that happen. The next day, I called Greg. I need you to find everything you can on Victor Rhodes, I told him. And I mean everything. Greg hesitated. You sure you want to go down that road? I've heard rumors about this guy. He's not someone you mess with lightly. I don't care, I said, my jaw tightening. We're taking him down. Greg agreed to start digging, but even he seemed uneasy about it. I could tell that going after someone like Victor wasn't just a job for him. It was a risk, a big one, but I didn't care. I had already taken down Andrew, and now it was Victor's turn. I wasn't naive enough to think this would be easy. Victor had power, influence, and resources I couldn't begin to match. But I had something he didn't, nothing left to lose. I had already lost my marriage, my home, and my sense of security. The only thing left was my drive for revenge. And this time, I wasn't going to let anyone stop me. The moment I made the decision to go after Victor, everything changed. I had been chasing shadows with Andrew, thinking I was in control. But now, with Victor in my sights, I realized just how deep the game really went. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about survival. Greg didn't waste time. He started digging into Victor's past, his business dealings, everything that might give us a crack in his armor. The problem was, Victor had covered his tracks well. No public scandals, no visible dirt. He wasn't just powerful, he was untouchable. That made him dangerous, but it also made him vulnerable. No one is truly clean, and I was determined to find out what he was hiding. A few weeks into the investigation, Greg called me with a lead. I found something, he said. It's small, but it might be the opening we need. Victor's tied to a real estate development deal in Miami. On the surface, it looks legit, but there's a lot of money moving through offshore accounts. If we can link that to any illegal activity, we might have something. I didn't hesitate. Follow the money, I said. I want every detail. While Greg focused on the financial angle, I started gathering my own intel. I needed to understand Victor's connections, who he was working with, who was protecting him. It wasn't long before I realized just how far his influence reached. Politicians, law enforcement, corporate CEOs, they were all in his pocket. The deeper I dug, the more I understood why Jessica had been so terrified. Victor wasn't just a businessman. He was a kingmaker, someone who could destroy lives with a phone call. But I wasn't backing down. I couldn't. Weeks passed, and Greg's investigation into the Miami deal was getting closer to something concrete. He had found a series of shell companies that Victor was using to funnel money, and it looked like some of it was tied to organized crime. It was the kind of information that could ruin Victor if it ever got out. But just as we were preparing to make our move, things took a turn. One night, I was heading back to my apartment when I noticed a black SUV parked a few doors down. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then I saw it again the next day and the day after that. Someone was watching me. I called Greg, told him about the car. It's Victor, he said flatly. He knows you're closing in. I wasn't surprised, but it still sent a chill through me. Victor was making his move. I had a feeling things were about to escalate, but I wasn't prepared for what happened next. A few days later, I got home to find my apartment door ajar. My heart raced as I pushed it open, bracing myself for what I might find. The place was trashed, drawers pulled out, furniture overturned. But it wasn't just a robbery. This was a message. They hadn't taken anything valuable. Instead, they had left something behind. A photo of Jessica and me from years ago, torn in half. Victor was reminding me that he knew everything. I called Greg, my voice shaking with anger. He's making this personal. Greg's tone was grim. It's already personal, but we're running out of time, Daniel. We need to hit him before he hits us. That night, I didn't sleep. My mind was racing with what to do next. Victor was tightening the noose, but I wasn't going to let him choke me out. I had come too far, and I had one last card to play. The next morning, Greg called with the break we needed. "I've got it," he said. "Proof of money laundering through Victor's shell companies. If we leak this, it'll blow up everything. His business, his political connections, it'll all come crashing down." But we couldn't just go to the authorities. Victor had too many people in his pocket, and going the legal route would tip him off. He'd bury the evidence before anything could stick. We needed to be smarter, faster. I decided to take the evidence straight to the media. I had a contact at a major newspaper, a reporter who owed me a favor. I knew if I gave him what Greg had found, he'd publish it without hesitation. Once the story was out, it would be too big for even Victor to suppress. I met with the reporter in a parking garage downtown, handing him a folder filled with documents. "This is it," I said. "Everything you need to take him down." He flipped through the papers, his eyes widening as he realized what he was holding. "Jesus, this is big," he muttered. "I'll get this to my editor. We'll run it first thing in the morning." It was done. The wheels were in motion, and there was no turning back. All I had to do now was wait. That night, I stayed up, pacing my apartment, nerves on edge. I knew Victor wouldn't go down without a fight, but I wasn't sure how far he'd go to protect himself. As dawn broke, I checked my phone. Nothing yet. Then, just after 7 a.m., the first headline hit. "Business tycoon Victor Rhodes linked to money laundering scandal." It was out. The story spread like wildfire, picked up by every major outlet within hours. And just like that, Victor's empire began to crumble. By noon, his business partners were distancing themselves, his political allies were silent, and investors were pulling out. The pressure was mounting, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the authorities stepped in. But the victory was short-lived. That afternoon, Greg called me, his voice tense. "We got a problem," he said. "Jessica's missing." I froze. "What do you mean, missing?" "She was last seen leaving her apartment this morning. No one's heard from her since. I think Victor's taken her." My mind raced. I hadn't spoken to Jessica since our last meeting at the cafe, but the thought of her in Victor's hands sent a wave of dread through me. I knew he was capable of anything. "We need to find her," I said, already grabbing my jacket. "Before it's too late." Greg and I started piecing together any leads we could find on where Victor might have taken Jessica. We knew he had safe houses, properties all over the city, but narrowing it down was a needle-in-a-haystack situation. Time was running out, and every minute felt like an hour. Just when I thought we had hit a dead end, Greg got a tip from one of his contacts. "There's a place in the industrial district," he said. "A warehouse Victor's been using for meetings. It's off the grid, no one's supposed to know about it. If he's holding her anywhere, it's there." We didn't waste any time. Greg and I headed straight for the warehouse, armed with nothing but desperation. When we arrived, it looked abandoned, rusted doors, broken windows. The whole place reeked of decay. But as we approached, I could hear voices inside. We crept around the back, slipping in through a side door. Inside, the place was dark, lit only by a few dim lights. My heart pounded in my chest as we moved quietly, searching for any sign of Jessica. Then I heard it, her voice, muffled, coming from one of the back rooms. I signaled to Greg, and we moved in. Pushing open the door, I found her, tied to a chair, bruised but alive. Victor stood over her, a gun in his hand, his face twisted in cold fury. "I knew you'd come," Victor said, his voice low and dangerous. "But it's too late, Daniel. You've already lost. Let her go," I said, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at me. Victor shook his head. "You think you're so smart. You think you've beaten me. But you've done nothing. This is just the beginning." He raised the gun, aiming it at Jessica. My heart stopped. "No!" I shouted, lunging forward. In the chaos that followed, Greg tackled Victor to the ground. The gun went off, the sound deafening in the small room. I scrambled to untie Jessica, pulling her to safety as Greg wrestled with Victor. Finally, the gun clattered to the floor, and Greg pinned Victor down. I grabbed the weapon, pointing it at him, my hands shaking. "You're finished," I said through gritted teeth. Victor just laughed, blood dripping from the corner of his mouth. You'll never be rid of me. I wanted to pull the trigger to end it right there, but I didn't. Instead, I handed the gun to Greg, who called the police. Victor was arrested, and the authorities had more than enough evidence to lock him away for life. Jessica, shaken but safe, thanked me for saving her, but there was no future for us. Our story had ended long before this nightmare. As for me, I walked away from it all. Victor was gone, his empire destroyed, and I had my freedom. It wasn't the clean, perfect revenge I had envisioned. It was messy, painful, and left scars that would never fully heal. But in the end, I had won, and that was enough.